Claire Emerson had always imagined her wedding day as a radiant chapter in her life, the kind where fairy tales begin, where promises bloom like wildflowers in June, where love wraps around your soul like a warm silk scarf on a winter morning. But nothing about that day felt magical. The towering Westbrook estate glimmered under chandeliers worth more than her childhood home, and the aisle stretched longer than the path she had taken to get there. But as she stood in her white satin gown with trembling hands entwined in Liam Westbrook's, she felt an unbearable hollowness that no bouquet could mask. His blue eyes, once the reason her heart skipped beats, were now colder than December winds, scanning the crowd more than they ever looked into hers. The cameras clicked, the guests smiled, but beneath the surface was a heartbreak silently bleeding. Liam had married her not for love, but to silence the media that questioned his loyalty to real values, to prove he could be humble enough to marry a simple girl. But Claire was never simple. She was a masterpiece that society failed to frame, a melody never given its chorus. From the moment the rings were exchanged, Claire could feel something dying in his embrace, a silence that would grow louder with each passing day. His mother, Meredith, made it no secret that she loathed Claire's middle-class background, whispering cruel comments at dinner, comparing her to polished socialites, and branding her invisible at every turn. Claire tried, how she tried to blend into their world, to soften her voice, to straighten her curls, to become the trophy wife they wished upon her. But love was not meant to be earned through suffering, and the more she gave, the less she seemed to matter. Liam, swayed by his mother's poison and his own vanity, began drifting like a kite cut loose from its string-spending nights in clubs, laughing too long with leggy models, his cologne lingering on his shirt collars like guilt that refused to wash away. He blamed her for his boredom, for his lack of spark, as if her love were a flaw, not a gift. Every night, Claire curled into herself on the vast king-size bed, tears tracing paths down her cheeks as she stared at the ceiling, wishing for the version of Liam who once held her hand at the lakeside and whispered dreams into the wind. But those dreams were dead, and nothing she did could revive them. The final crack came one cold evening, under the amber glow of the hallway chandelier, when Liam, in a voice as sharp as broken glass, hissed words that would haunt her forever. "You're not what I wanted. You're dull. You're ugly." It wasn't just an insult, it was a shattering, a violent unmaking of every ounce of love she still carried for him. Her breath caught, her soul fractured, and for a moment, time stood still. Claire didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply walked away from the man who had once promised to protect her heart. That night, under the moon that watched with quiet sympathy, she packed nothing but her dignity, her wedding band left on the marble sink like a discarded dream. No one stopped her. Not Liam, not Meredith, not even the house staff, who watched with wide eyes as the girl with the broken smile vanished into the rain-soaked darkness, becoming a ghost of the life she was forced to leave behind. The rain clung to Claire's hair like sorrow, refusing to let go as she stepped off the bus in a town she couldn't even pronounce. A sleepy coastal village with chipped sidewalks, salted winds, and strangers who didn't know her name just the way she wanted it. She rented a tiny studio above a bakery that smelled of cinnamon and quiet comfort, and began working at a diner on the corner where the tables were worn but the people kind. She poured coffee with a soft smile, never mentioning the name Westbrook or the mansion she once walked through like a ghost. Mornings came with early sunrises and the gentle hum of ocean waves, but nights were still battles until she chose to fight back. Claire began rising before dawn, slipping into the local gym while the world still slept, shedding not just weight but the heaviness that had once clung to her ribs like shackles. Each drop of sweat was a goodbye to the woman who had been broken for loving someone too deeply. She devoured books on healing, journals on reclaiming self-worth, quotes scribbled into the margins like lifelines. Therapy sessions became sacred, a place where she spoke without flinching, where tears were not shameful but necessary, like rain on a drought-starved garden. With every passing month, her shoulders straightened, her walk grew firmer, and her mirror stopped being the enemy. Her once muted glow returned like spring sunlight after a cruel winter, and men who passed her in the diner began to notice and note just the curve of her lips but the quiet fire behind her eyes. Her beauty, now unchained from pain, radiated from confidence, from choice, from rising when she had every reason to stay down. And while she stitched herself back together in silence, miles away, Liam's glittering world began to rust. His boardroom faced a lawsuit over a failed acquisition, investors were pulling out, and the woman he had left Claire for, Sophia Maddoxshad, been caught on camera slipping into the penthouse of another billionaire with a smirk that mirrored the one she once wore in his bed. Liam, once envied for his charm and legacy, now looked into mirrors and didn't recognize the hollowness staring back. He drank too much, trusted too few, and began realizing too late that not everything glittered with value. His mother, Meredith, once the puppeteer behind his pride, now tightened her grip with every misstep, using her influence as a weapon. Meanwhile, Claire, free from that poisonous legacy, took a quiet leap forward. She applied to volunteer at a local startup incubator for young entrepreneurs, wanting to give others what she never received: support, belief, a fresh beginning. It was there she met Damian Cole, a man as composed as he was unreadable, with eyes like stormy skies and a mind that built empires. He had arrived unannounced one afternoon, observing a presentation with arms folded, his reputation arriving 5 minutes before he did. Damian wasn't flashy like Liam. He moved with the confidence of someone who didn't need to speak to be heard. Rumor had it he'd built his first company in a basement and turned it into a billion-dollar empire. But what intrigued Claire wasn't his money. It was the way he looked at people, not through them. When they first shook hands, his fingers were warm, steady, and his eyes didn't wander to her curves or her face. They lingered, curious, at her poise, like he'd just found an unexpected treasure in an ordinary place. Claire didn't flutter or flirt. She was past the age of performing for attention, but something in her softened in his presence, a pause in her usually guarded breath, a question in her mind she wasn't ready to ask yet. Damian began showing up more often, listening to her pitches, offering feedback, sometimes staying after the meetings to ask about her thoughts, her vision, her voice. And slowly, the space between them filled not with forced attraction or cliché moments, but with mutual respect, that rare soil from which real affection grows. Claire was no longer the woman who was walked away from. She was becoming the woman others walked toward. And though she hadn't noticed yet, the seeds of a new story were already taking root, tone that didn't begin with heartbreak, but with her rediscovery of worth, in a town that had no idea just how far she had come to find herself again. The grand ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and gold-accented columns, but all the light in the room seemed to bend toward one woman, Claire Emerson, who stood tall in a crimson silk gown that hugged her newfound grace like it had been sewn from her rebirth. She wasn't trying to be seen, yet every eye in the room found her. Her presence was a quiet storm, commanding without effort, elegant without seeking validation. Damian stood beside her, timeless in a tailored charcoal suit, one hand resting gently at her back, a touch so subtle, yet it spoke volumes of quiet admiration and protection. Claire moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her soft smile masking the nerves that trembled beneath, because she knew tonight marked more than a gala, it was a reckoning. Whispers followed her like perfume. Who is she? Isn't that Claire? She looks unbelievable. And then, across the room, a cough broke through the chatter. Not from illness, but from shock. Liam Westbrook stood frozen by the bar, glass clutched midair, as if the ice in his whiskey had chilled his spine. His breath caught, and for a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. This couldn't be the same woman he discarded like last season's nameplate. But it was. Claire, the wife he never really touched, now floated across the room like a queen, unaware of her former crown. His throat went dry as he stumbled forward, years of regret pounding behind his ribs like a war drum. Claire? He whispered, barely audible, but loud enough for her to hear across the buzzing crowd. She turned, not startled, not angry, just poised. Her eyes meeting his like the wind brushing against a closed door. No pain, no longing. Just silence, illiberate, dignified, devastating. And in that silence, Liam felt something crack deep inside, a fracture not even his ego could ignore. He stepped closer, stammering something that sounded like an apology but tasted like dust. I didn't know you'd be here, he mumbled, reaching for the ghost of a past he never cherished. Claire's lips twitched into a polite, unreadable line. But before she could speak, or perhaps before she decided not to, Damian appeared beside her, calm and composed, his presence enough to command the moment without a word. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Claire and Liam with a quiet intensity, the kind that comes from power, not anger. She's not available for ghosts, Damian said smoothly, his voice like velvet layered over steel. Liam flinched as if struck, not by the words, but by the certainty in Damian's tone, like Claire's past had been officially closed, sealed, and protected by someone who actually saw her worth. The silence that followed was thick, electric, painful. Claire didn't look at Liam again. She placed her hand on Damien's arm, the way a woman does when she's certain of who she belongs, but not because she's claimed, but because she's valued. Liam stood frozen, watching them walk away, her gown trailing like a flag of silent victory. Around him, the crowd resumed their chatter, but for Liam, the noise faded. All he could see was the woman he'd called plain now blooming in a room full of kings. He remembered the way she used to look at him with hope in her eyes, and how he dimmed it without a second thought. He remembered the nights he ignored her, the names he called her, the way he let her leave without lifting a finger. And now, standing alone beneath chandeliers that cost more than her entire wardrobe once did, he realized something brutal. He hadn't just lost her. He'd never even tried to keep her. That night, as Claire and Damien disappeared into the velvet evening, Liam stood in his custom tuxedo feeling poorer than he ever had, drowning in the knowledge that he had thrown away a woman who had only ever asked for love and given her nothing but absence. It was the kind of regret that clung like smoke and stayed long after the music faded, long after the gala ended, long after she was gone, because now, she wasn't just gone, she had risen. As the gala buzz faded into the past, whispers of Claire's stunning reappearance echoed louder than applause ever could, reaching places she didn't even imagine, places like Meredith Westbrook's pristine, ice-cold estate, where the former queen of high society paced the marble floors in fury, gripping her pearls as if they could protect her from the truth now clawing at her legacy. When Meredith saw the headlines "Mysterious Woman" beside Damien Cole at Global Summit Gala, she nearly shattered her wine glass in her hand. It wasn't just the sight of Claire radiant in red, or the way Damien, one of the most powerful CEOs in America, looked at her like she was his compassit. Was the horror that someone she once called invisible had now become unforgettable. Without waiting, she dialed her son, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but venom. "How could you let that nobody outshine you, Liam?" she hissed, her bitterness curling through the phone like smoke. But Liam, whose shame had fermented into something resembling clarity, no longer bowed to his mother's cruel theater. His voice was low, bitter, tired. "She was never a nobody. You just convinced me to treat her like one." The silence that followed was loud. Meredith's grip loosened, for once realizing that the empire she built on pride and perfection was crumbling, and Claire was rising from its ashes, untouched by the dirt they once buried her in. Weeks later, cornered by a mounting pile of debt from failed ventures and fake friends, Meredith did what she'd sworn she never would. She sought out Claire. The encounter took place at a charity brunch hosted at a downtown rooftop garden, where Claire had been invited as a featured speaker for a women's empowerment initiative. Dressed in ivory silk, her hair flowing in soft waves, she looked like the embodiment of grace, not because she was trying, but because she no longer needed to. Meredith approached her with a carefully rehearsed expression, part apology, part desperation, but Claire didn't flinch. She listened with patience as Meredith spun her scripted remorse, words dripping in manipulation masked as regret. "I may have been harsh, but I see now that you've become someone impressive." Claire's gaze was steady, her tone like calm thunder. "Your son left me for not being enough. I became everything without him." Her words cut with quiet finality, not intended to wound, but to declare freedom, and everyone within earshot felt it. No drama, no shouting, just a woman who had reclaimed her voice and no longer needed anyone's approval to be heard. Meredith blinked, stunned, and for the first time in years, she had no reply. Meanwhile, Damien, always observing from a distance yet never too far, witnessed the moment with a kind of awe most men reserve for miracles. He wasn't falling for Claire because she was beautiful, though she was breathtaking. He was falling for her because she carried her pain like armor, her integrity like a crown, and her silence like a sword. He admired the way she walked into rooms as if she belonged there, even when she doubted herself, and how she never used her past as a crutch, but as proof that she survived what tried to destroy her. Claire, still cautious, wasn't sure what to make of Damien's attention. She'd built walls not out of bricks, but out of memories that still stung when touched. But each time Damien smiled at her like she was the sunrise in a sky full of static, a piece of her doubt began to melt. He never rushed her, never expected her to perform affection, never mistook kindness for weakness. He simply existed beside her like a lighthouse, steady, guiding, patient. She began to notice the way her shoulders relaxed when he entered a room, how her laughter returned when he teased her gently, how she found herself searching for his voice in a crowd like a melody she wasn't ready to lose. Love wasn't blooming overnight, But something gentler, slower, safer. It was in the way he asked her about her dreams, not her past. In how he remembered the smallest things she said, like her favorite flower or the kind of tea she liked after long meetings. Claire wasn't falling in love yet, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the fall. And as for Damien, he knew what rare treasure looked like. He had built empires, but he had never seen anything more precious than the fire in Claire's eyes when she believed in herself. And though she didn't say it, not yet, not out loud, she had started believing again. Not just in love, but in the idea that perhaps, this time, she would not be abandoned halfway through her story. The first time Claire saw the vineyard spread out before her like a golden dream, she couldn't believe something so quiet, so beautiful, still existed in the world. Like peace had grown roots between the hills. The sun was low, painting the sky in hues of amber and lavender, and a soft breeze tugged at her hair, as if inviting her to let go of everything heavy she carried. Damien had flown them to Napa Valley for what he called a weekend work event. But Claire suspected from the start that it was more than that. He didn't bring his usual team, didn't check his phone every 5 minutes, didn't talk about profits or mergers. Instead, he was fully present, watching her reactions to the vineyard tour, asking about her favorite kind of wine, and quietly memorizing the curve of her laughter. That afternoon, they explored the grounds, walked slowly between the grapevines, sipping samples poured into elegant glasses, letting silence speak when words weren't needed. Claire found herself talking about her childhood, how she used to imagine castles in fields of sunflowers, how her mother used to braid her hair with daisies in the summer. Damien listened, not to respond, but to understand. There was something about him, how he never interrupted, how his eyes didn't wander, how he seemed to be fully hers for every second they were together, that made her feel, maybe for the first time, completely seen. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the hills, Damien led her to a private courtyard strung with delicate fairy lights and set for two. A soft instrumental melody played in the background, something warm and old and romantic. She smiled as he poured her a glass of deep red Cabernet, his hand brushing hers just long enough to make her heart pause. Then, after a moment of stillness, he looked at her with a vulnerability he rarely let the world see and said, "I've built empires, Claire, but with you, I feel like a man, not a machine." Her breath caught, not because of the words, but the sincerity behind them. She didn't need grand gestures. That single sentence told her more about his heart than all the boardroom accolades ever could. They sipped wine, talked about dreams instead of fears, and for a while, Claire forgot the bruises her past had left behind. As the music swelled gently and twilight wrapped around them like a soft shawl, Damien stood and reached out his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low, steady, hopeful. She hesitated, not out of doubt, but disbelief that someone could ask her something so simple, so kind, without expecting anything in return. Then she placed her hand in his. They moved slowly, rhythmically, their bodies close but not pressed, hearts beating in quiet harmony. There were no dramatic declarations, no passionate kisses, just the intimacy of two souls rediscovering what it meant to be tender. Damien didn't try to own her. He simply offered his presence, and Claire met him halfway. At one point, as they swayed beneath the stars, he rested his forehead against hers, not for possession, not for desire, but for connection. And in that small act, 1,000 unspoken emotions passed between them like a private vow. She closed her eyes, and in the quiet warmth between them, she felt something soften inside her that had been stiff with pain for years. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something real, something safe, slow, and pure. A love she didn't need to beg for, a love that waited patiently until she was ready. The city skyline faded beneath the plane's wing as Claire and Damien prepared for their flight to New York, a city humming with ambition and shadows, the perfect place for a summit that could rewrite industries and, silently, lives. In the lounge, Claire moved with effortless poise, her tailored slate gray suit hugging her elegance, heels clicking softly against polished marble, her chestnut curls cascading like confidence down her shoulders. She wasn't dressed to impress, she was dressed as the woman she had become. Damien, beside her, held her hand in the way a man does when he knows its worth, never gripping, only grounding. Their laughter echoed quietly between them, not loud but shared, the kind of laughter that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. As they moved toward the boarding gate, her badge swinging from a lanyard marked executive speaker, Claire didn't expect fate to confront her in the most mundane Placier security line, dull and routine, until she saw the shape of a man she once vowed never to look for again. Liam Westbrook stood alone, hair unkempt, tie askew, his face hollowed by the erosion of pride and the weight of regret. His shoes were scuffed, his gaze sunken, his posture missing the arrogance it once wore like armor. When he spotted Claire glowing, radiant, Complete's breath caught like a broken lyric he no longer had the voice to sing. Her presence hit him like a hurricane of everything he had abandoned. Beauty, kindness, strength, growth. She didn't look surprised. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, once dimmed by his cruelty, now shimmered with peace he couldn't claim. She leaned into Damien slightly, sharing a smile about something unspoken, the way lovers do when they don't need an audience, just each other. Liam stood still, paralyzed, not by shame alone but by the crushing realization that the girl he discarded had not only survived but soared. He remembered the nights he walked past her tears, the moments he shrugged off her silence, the way he told himself she'd never matter once gone. But now, with the terminal buzzing and her heels clicking past him like a quiet thunder, he knew she was the only one who ever mattered at all. His mouth parted, a whisper of a name rising from a throat full of swallowed guilt, but no sound escaped. Damien noticed him immediately, the man who once owned the heart he now protected, and without a word, he wrapped an arm around Claire's waist, not in jealousy, but in quiet claim, as if to say, she is safe now. She is mine to cherish, not possess. Claire, pausing just enough for a moment to register the man who had once shattered her, met Liam's gazonot with anger, not with vengeance, but with something far more powerful, grace. Her voice was soft, just above the hum of the crowd, but it struck like a bell through stained glass. Some losses, she said gently, teach you your worth. She took a step closer, only to finish with the words that sealed her freedom. Thank you for letting me go. Liam didn't blink. He couldn't. All he could do was watch the woman he once deemed forgettable walk past with the man who saw her as irreplaceable. And as she disappeared down the jet bridge, laughter on her lips and light in her eyes, Liam realized he hadn't lost her at the airport that day. He had lost her long before. In the quiet moments, he failed to love her when it mattered most. And now, that chance was no longer just gone, it was redeemed by someone else. As Claire and Damien disappeared beyond the terminal gates and the echoes of the past faded behind them, a new chapter unfolded, where the woman once underestimated now stood at the forefront of rooms filled with admiration, not pity. Months after the summit, Claire's presence had become more than striking, it had become legendary. Her calm confidence, her refined strength, her story of transformation had quietly rippled through boardrooms and conference halls until it landed her an invitation to speak at a prestigious women's leadership panel in San Francisco. She had hesitated at first, uncertain whether the world truly needed to hear her pain, but Damien, always believing in her voice even when it trembled, held her hand the night before and whispered, "There are women out there who are still where you used to be. Speak for them." And so she did. Standing under soft lights, in a cream blazer and power red heels, Claire took the stage with a stillness that commanded attention. She didn't speak with fire, she spoke with truth. Her voice was steady, not loud, but every syllable landed with the force of 1,000 women rising beside her. "I was once called ugly, unworthy, replaceable," she began, and a hush fell across the auditorium. "I believed it for a long time. I shrank. I folded. I disappeared to make others more comfortable. But the truth is, real beauty begins the moment you decide to value yourself. The moment you choose your own reflection over someone else's opinion. Love isn't about begging to be noticed. It's about being seen, felt, and respected. And if someone can't do that, they don't deserve a seat at your table." As she paused, the silence was deafening, not from disinterest, but from hearts splitting wide open. Damien sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly, eyes glistening with tears he didn't try to hide. He had witnessed her journey, walked beside her transformation, but seeing her own it so boldly, it unraveled something even deeper in him. She wasn't just the woman he loved. She was the woman who reminded the world what it meant to rise. The clip of her speech was posted online later that night, and by morning, it had gone viral. Shared by celebrities, activists, and everyday women who saw their own stories echoed in her words. Claire's name became synonymous with strength. But while the world buzzed, Claire remained grounded. She declined interviews, ignored brand deals. Her focus was never fame, was healing. And so, in the quietest way possible, she and Damien flew to the Amalfi Coast, where a private ceremony awaited them on a windswept cliff draped in white roses and ocean mist. There were no paparazzi, no headlines. Just the sound of waves crashing below as Damien vowed to never be the man who made her feel small. And Claire promised to never shrink herself again, not for love, not for comfort, not for anyone. Their vows were whispered through trembling smiles, and when they sealed it with a kiss, even the breeze seemed to soften in approval. Their rings weren't encrusted with diamonds, but with simple engraving: seen, heard, loved. In that moment, Claire wasn't a survivor. She wasn't a phoenix. She was simply a woman who had fought her way back to herself and finally arrived. Somewhere across the globe, in a dim apartment cluttered with yesterday's regret, Liam scrolled through the photos when they surfaced online, a snapshot of Claire laughing, veil fluttering, barefoot in the sand beside a man who looked at her like she hung the stars. There was no jealousy in Liam's chest, not anymore. Only an ache, a dull, irreversible ache, not just because he had lost her, but because he had never really known her to begin with. He remembered the girl he thought was too plain, too quiet, too soft. And now, looking at her radiant and free, he realized she had always been extraordinary. He just never stayed long enough to see her bloom. Claire, however, didn't spare a thought for him anymore. She had moved beyond the places where his shadow once lingered. Her life was full now with purpose, with laughter, with a man who didn't complete her but complemented the woman she had become. She returned from Italy with a heart uncluttered, her past no longer a burden but a blueprint. She began mentoring young women, launching a foundation for self-worth education, and continued speaking not for applause, but for impact. Her name no longer reminded her of pain, but of power. The girl once called invisible had become impossible to ignore. And on evenings when the world was quiet and Damien would wrap his arms around her, pressing his cheek to hers, Claire would smile not because she'd won, but because she was finally whole. Peace wasn't a place she found, it was a home she built inside herself. Her scars weren't erased. They simply stopped bleeding. And in the soft rhythm of her forever with Damien, she knew. Love wasn't about being rescued. It was about being seen in the storm and chosen anyway. And this time, she had chosen herself first.